Pull the dipstick after 1 week of normal driving and watch the tip come back nearly dry, and something cold drops into your stomach because you topped it off just last weekend, and now a full quart has simply vanished into thin air. No puddle on the driveway, no drips under the oil pan, just gone. And then you catch it at the next stoplight. That faint blue haze curling out of the tailpipe when you accelerate, the smell of burning oil drifting into the cabin, and you already know what the emission station is going to say before you even drive down there. So you take it to the dealership, and the service advisor plugs in the scanner, nods slowly, and slides a printout across the counter that reads $4,000 for a complete engine teardown to replace the piston rings. And he says it like it is the only option on planet Earth, like your car is a lost cause, and the only path forward is cracking the block wide open. Here is what he did not tell you, and it is the single most important thing you will hear this week. He never actually diagnosed why your engine is burning oil. He assumed. He looked at an aging car, saw blue smoke, and reached straight for the most expensive job in the shop, without spending 5 minutes finding out whether your piston rings are physically worn out or simply stuck. And those are two completely different problems, with two completely different price tags, one of which costs $4,000 and one of which costs less than $20. The truth that keeps a whole lot of dealership service departments quiet is that a huge number of oil-burning engines do not have worn-out rings at all. They have coked rings. Down inside every cylinder, riding on the piston, there is a set of thin oil control rings whose entire job is to scrape excess oil off the cylinder wall on every stroke so it does not get burned in the combustion chamber. Those rings sit in narrow grooves, and they are designed to flex and expand outward to stay in contact with the wall. But under the intense heat right behind the piston, over tens of thousands of miles, oil that lingers in those grooves bakes into a hard carbon deposit, a crusty lacquer that fills the groove and glues the ring in place. Once that happens, the ring can no longer expand and float against the cylinder wall. It is frozen. It stops scraping. And oil that should have been wiped back down into the pan instead climbs up past the piston and burns. And that is your blue smoke, your vanishing quart, your failed emissions test. Nobody cracked a piston. Nobody wore anything out. The rings are physically fine. They are just packed solid with baked-on carbon, and the fix for that is chemistry and patience, not a teardown. So before you hand anyone $4,000, hit subscribe and join the garage underground, because the dealership counts on you being too scared and too rushed to ask the one question that saves you the money, and I am going to walk you through exactly how to tell the difference and exactly what to do about it. Let me be dead straight with you about the villain here, because it is not oil companies hiding some secret 1940s potion, and anybody selling you that story is lying to your face. The villain is a service model that skips diagnosis and jumps to the highest invoice, that shows you blue smoke and quotes you a rebuild without ever running the two cheap tests that would tell everyone in the room what is actually wrong. Those tests are the forbidden knowledge, not a magic bottle, and here they are. Test 1 is a compression test. You buy or borrow a compression gauge for about $15, warm the engine, pull the spark plugs, thread the gauge into each cylinder in turn, crank the engine over a few times, and write down the pressure. Test 2 is the smarter follow-up, the wet test. On any cylinder that read low, you squirt a small amount of oil into the spark plug hole and test compression again. This is the moment of truth. If the number jumps up significantly with oil added, that oil temporarily sealed the ring gap, and that tells you the rings are not sealing well, and combined with clean plugs, it points hard towards stuck or worn rings, rather than a burned valve or a blown head gasket. If the number barely moves, your problem is somewhere else entirely, likely valve seals or a head gasket, and that is a different repair, so you just saved yourself from throwing chemistry at the wrong thing. And there is a third read hiding in these two tests that most people miss, which is the pattern across cylinders. Write every number down. If one cylinder is way down and the rest are healthy, that is a localized problem, often a single burned valve or a single stuck ring, and it changes what you do next. If several cylinders read low together and they all jump on the wet test, that is the classic signature of general ring coking across an engine that has simply cooked its oil control rings over the years, and that is precisely the situation where a full detergent and solvent cycle earns its keep. If two adjacent cylinders read low and neither responds to oil, start thinking head gasket between those two cylinders instead of rings, and again you have just steered yourself away from a cleaning job that would have done nothing. That is the whole game. $15, a spark plug socket, and an afternoon in the driveway tells you what a $4,000 quote conveniently skipped, and it tells you in numbers you wrote down yourself, not in a service advisor's confident guess. Now here is where honesty becomes your best friend, because I am not going to promise you a miracle in 7 days, and anyone who does is setting you up to be disappointed. Deposit cleaning works on deposits. It does not restore metal. If your compression is low and the wet test shows the rings are stuck with carbon, cleaning chemistry has a genuine shot at freeing them and cutting or stopping your oil consumption. If your rings are actually worn thin, or your cylinder walls are scored, or your valve guides are shot, no fluid on earth fixes that, and you should not expect it to. Knowing which camp you are in, that is the credibility, and that is what protects you from wasting money in either direction. So let us talk about what actually loosens baked-on carbon in a ring groove, described honestly, no invented chemistry. Two things do real work here. The first is detergency. A high-quality top-tier motor oil carries a strong detergent and dispersant additive package, whose job is literally to keep deposits from forming and to slowly lift and suspend deposits that already exist so they get carried away and trapped in the filter. Running a fresh fill of a strong detergent oil and then driving the car hard enough to get everything good and hot for a full oil change interval gives those detergents time to work at the deposits gradually. The second tool is a dedicated solvent, and there are two honest ways to use it. One is an engine flush additive that you add to the old oil and idle for the short time the product specifies right before you drain, letting concentrated solvents soak and soften deposits so they wash out with the old oil. The other, and the more aggressive option for a truly stuck cylinder, is a top-end or piston soak, where with the plugs out you introduce a penetrating solvent directly on top of the piston, let it sit for hours or overnight so it seeps down into the ringlands and softens the carbon from above, then clear it before restarting. Neither of these is exotic and neither is secret. They soften carbon and carry it away, and how well they work depends entirely on how baked on the deposit is and how many miles of hot driving you give the detergents afterward to finish the job. And this is the part worth sitting with because it explains why patience beats a single dramatic pour. A deposit that took 40,000 miles of heat to build up is not going to surrender in 20 minutes of idling. The detergent package in a good oil works at it slowly, lifting a little on every heat cycle, suspending it, dumping it into the filter, and that is why running the fresh detergent fill across a real interval of hot driving does more than any single flush poured in and drained the same afternoon. The flush and the soak crack the deposit and soften the surface. The miles of hot detergent oil afterward are what actually carry it out grain by grain. Think of it as loosening a rusted bolt with penetrant. The penetrant does the soaking, but you still have to work the wrench back and forth. And the wrench here is heat and time and a strong detergent circulating past those rings thousands of times. Sometimes a mildly stuck ring frees up beautifully and the smoke clears over a few hundred miles. Sometimes a rock-hard deposit only partially releases and you regain some compression, but not all. That is the honest range of outcomes, and it still beats a $4,000 teardown you might not have needed. Now, let me tear apart the shelf product you have already seen advertised. The $30 can of engine restorer that promises to reverse everything in one pour. Read what is actually in a lot of those cans. A large share of them are thick viscosity index improvers, heavy polymer goo that you dump in, and that raises the apparent thickness of your oil, so compression numbers look a little better for a little while. That is not cleaning anything, that is masking. Thickening your oil into syrup can starve your upper valve train and cam of proper lubrication on cold startup, which is exactly when most engine wear happens, so you can actually trade a little less smoke today for accelerated wear tomorrow. It treats the symptom you can see and quietly makes the real problem worse. That is the opposite of what you want, and it is why the diagnosis first approach matters so much. Because once you know it is deposits, you reach for real detergents and real solvents that remove the carbon, not a polymer that just papers over it. Here is the exact protocol, start to finish, and read the warning inside it carefully because it matters. Step 1. Run your compression test and your wet test and confirm you are actually dealing with stuck rings and clean plugs, not a head gasket or valve seals. Step 2. If you are going to do a piston soak on a badly stuck cylinder, pull the plugs, get the piston partway down the bore, introduce your penetrating solvent according to the product directions, and let it soak for the hours the product calls for. Then, before you restart, crank the engine over with the plugs still out to clear any liquid that could hydrolock a cylinder, and wear eye protection because it will spray out of the plug holes. Step 3. Drain the old oil completely while it is warm so it carries the most suspended junk out with it, and change the oil filter. Step 4. Refill with a quality top-tier detergent oil in the correct viscosity for your engine, using the grade your manufacturer specifies, not some heavier grade you hope will hide the smoke. Step 5. Drive the car normally, but do not baby it. Get it fully up to operating temperature regularly across a full oil change interval, so the detergents have real time and real heat to keep working the deposits loose. Step 6. At the end of that interval, change the oil and filter again to dump out everything the detergents lifted and recheck your consumption. The critical warning is this: you must confirm before any of this that your engine does not have an active physical mechanical failure, a blown head gasket, a cracked piston, a scored bore. That is exactly what the compression and wet test are for. If you skip the diagnosis and start flushing an engine that has a genuine structural break, thin solvents and thinned oil can slip past the damage and strip the lubricating film off your bearings, and a bearing running dry does not fail quietly, it fails catastrophically, so the test is not optional. The test is the entire foundation this method stands on, and it is the step the dealership skipped when they wrote you that $4,000 quote. Line it up and look at it plainly. On one side, a $4,000 engine teardown sold to you on an assumption, with nobody having spent 5 minutes finding out whether your rings were worn or simply stuck. On the other side, a $15 compression gauge, an honest wet test, a bottle of solvent, a fresh fill of good detergent oil, and a few hundred miles of driving, with a clear-eyed understanding that it fixes deposits and not worn metal, and a diagnosis that tells you which one you have before you spend a cent on parts. That is the difference between being a driver who gets steered and a driver who knows. If your car smokes, if it burns oil, if somebody just handed you a teardown quote, send this to them right now before they sign anything, because the $20 test that tells the truth is the one thing the $4,000 invoice was hoping they would never